Brought to you by Williams. We make clean energy happen.
I'm Josh Christensen.
And I'm Liz Stinson, filling in for Yaz Gagne.
And this is Most Innovative Companies. On today's episode, Fast Company senior staff writer Liz Segran.
A lot of American brands, for the first time in a long time, began considering what it would look like to make products in America.
New Yorker writer and author of the Haves and Have-Yachts, Evan Osnos.
This feels really fragile and it feels volatile. And the question, of course, is why?
And as always, keeping tabs.
It's like a giant magnet pulling us through space.
But first, here's the download. The news you need to know this week in the world of business and innovation.
Tensions between Israel and Iran reached a boiling point last week when Israel struck Iran in a surprise attack targeting Iran's nuclear program. In the weeks since, the two countries have exchanged barrages of missiles, killing hundreds of Iranians and dozens of Israelis. As attacks escalated, President Trump abruptly left the G7 meeting last week, fueling speculation about potential U.S. involvement in the conflict. In response, oil prices have spiked, with two oil benchmarks rising over 4% each on Tuesday. U.S. markets have also responded, with the Nasdaq Composite and S&P 500 each declining nearly 1% at the end of last week, though they have rebounded this week.
Moving on to a cheerier topic, I guess. Tensions between tech giants OpenAI and Microsoft have escalated, according to a report by the Wall Street Journal this past Monday. The conflict is due to OpenAI's recent bid to acquire coding startup Windsurf. The companies, who are effectively rivals despite Microsoft's large investment in OpenAI. There was also that when Sam Altman was ousted from OpenAI. Do you remember this, Liz? And Microsoft was going to hire him?
That feels like eternity ago, and I do remember it. Yeah, they were chummy.
They were. This was such a, what's the right word for it? I keep referring to things as a Kendrick and Drake beef. I can't keep using that analogy. This is not that. We need to find another beef to refer to.
Yeah, I mean, look, like all is fair in AI and billions of dollars at stake, I would say. So loyalties be damned.
Part of the investment into OpenAI allows Microsoft access to OpenAI's technology, including tech it acquires. What's more, OpenAI needs approval from Microsoft to proceed in restructuring in order to meet investor demands.
So for our next story, the spending surge this spring has taken a sharp dive, with retail sales falling in May in response to President Trump's tariffs. Restaurant and retail sales dropped 0.9% in May, in part due to a significant 3.5% drop in vehicle sales. While the data suggests a pullback in consumer spending, economists still expect overall growth in spending for the April to June quarter.
That is a lot of numbers. All I know is I'm going to have to wait to buy my Nintendo Switch.
That's all you need to know.
With food dyes in the crosshairs of secretary and roadkill cuisine enthusiast RFK Jr.'s Department of Health and Human Services, Kraft Heinz has pledged by 2027 to remove all artificial colors from its foods, which includes Heinz ketchup, Jell-O, and Kraft mac and cheese. Do you want to see what the real color of Heinz ketchup is? I don't know if I want to see that.
I assume it's going to be a lighter red. What I don't want to see is the color of Kraft mac and cheese.
You mean that orange isn't naturally occurring?
I mean, it's just going to be beige, which, you know, is certainly more natural.
Yeah, who knows? The bechamel that you make with a Kraft mac and cheese powder is just not going to be the same. Other brands have followed suit, including General Mills, Pillsbury, Yoplait, and Nature Valley.
And finally, worried your iPhone is now going to cost $3,000 thanks to tariffs? Well, some good news. Now you can buy a phone from President Trump. This week, the Trump Organization announced the creation of Trump Mobile, a new cellular device that will provide 5G service that piggybacks off of carriers AT&T, T-Mobile, and Verizon. Its flagship cell plan, the 47 plan, will cost, you guessed it, $47.75 per month, and will include unlimited data, roadside assistance, and telehealth services. Wow, I feel like I just did an infomercial for Trump Mobile. Trump Mobile will also release a gold smartphone this fall for $499, so $500, dubbed the T1 phone, which will use the Android operating system. While the Trump Organization is technically under the control of his children while he's in office, the business venture still raises ethical concerns, with the president's relationship to this venture unclear. When pressed by Fast Company, Trump Mobile did not immediately respond to questions around where exactly the gold T1 phones would be manufactured. And Josh, they're saying that they're going to be manufactured in the U.S. I don't see how that's going to happen.
Yeah. We don't have any infrastructure to make any phones, I assume.
Yeah, this is definitely getting made in China, at least in the beginning, and probably forever if it gets made at all.
Yeah, I imagine there's going to be some sort of like pre-sale plan grift, then the phones never get delivered.
Sounds like a good business plan to me.
That's my bet right now. That's basically cryptocurrency. We just described cryptocurrency.
For our crypto president.
And that's the news you need to know today. So, Liz, first off, thanks for jumping in and co-hosting with me today. Yaz is sick, everybody. She will be back soon, but Liz is filling in for us today. So thank you first and foremost for coming on the show.
It is a pleasure to be here.
So I want to ask you, before we get to our first segment, do you have a go-to department store? Like when you need to get a new pair of pants or a shirt, where's the first place you're going?
That is such a good question. I grew up going to Dillard's and Yonkers. Do you know those department stores?
Only academically. I've never shopped at those places. I've heard of Dillard's. I have not heard of Yonkers. What in the Midwest is going on here? Is that a Midwest chain?
It absolutely is. Saying those names out loud is hilarious. I grew up in Nebraska, and those were the two department stores that my very small mall had. So when I think of department stores, that's where my brain goes because I am not a department store person. I know the value of them. I have friends who shop at department stores. You can get anything you need there. But when it comes to shopping, I make it really hard on myself and I have to go to 50 different stores in order to get what I need. So I think though, if I were to choose a department store, maybe it would be Bloomingdale's because Bloomingdale's it's just here. It's in Soho. It's convenient. There's also Printemps, which just opened in New York City and is a fancy department store that I wanted to check out. But Josh, unfortunately, you're asking the wrong person.
I feel like I just opened up Pandora's box.
Yeah, no, you were looking for a 2-word answer and I gave you about 2 minutes worth. So sorry about that.
Yeah, I'm kind of an Old Navy guy, is I guess what I was going for. Well, the reason why we're talking about this, because where many people shop and get their clothes and lots of other goods is Walmart. And that is one of the two companies that is central to a new story by Liz Segran. So the talking point most often cited behind the Trump administration's imposition of tariffs is that they will incentivize companies to return manufacturing to the United States. But how true is that? Reshoring cannot happen overnight, and decades of offshoring has left the manufacturing supply chain in America fragmented, to say the least. This is especially true for the apparel industry, but clothing manufacturing hasn't completely disappeared. There are some small companies that use what remains of the domestic supply chain infrastructure. That includes American Giant, a company that manufactures premium, all-American-made shirts, hoodies, and more. American Giant has something of a cult following and can hardly keep up with the demand for its products. Enter an unlikely partner, Walmart, whose low pricing strategy in part drove manufacturers overseas in the first place. So to hear more about this partnership and what it may mean for the revival of apparel manufacturing in the U.S., Liz and I talked to Fast Company staff writer Liz Segran. Okay, so before we get into this segment, I think I need to address the elephant in the room that we booked 2 Liz S's on the show for this segment. So going forward, we'll try to differentiate voices between Liz Segran, who's the reporter on this piece, and Liz Stinson, who's our design editor and who will be co-hosting with me today. So I'll try to use last names, but audience, remember the voices and track that in your head as we go forward.
We have very different voices, though, right, Liz? Don't you think?
You do have very different voices.
Yes, we do have very different voices. And this is an issue that we deal with often. But fortunately, so much of our communication happens through Slack that people can, they can differentiate.
I'm going to feel like a baseball coach being like, Segran, Stinson.
Yeah. No, I kind of like
Put
that.
me in, coach.
It makes me feel professional.
This is just a little aside, and I mean kind of apropos because we're in the middle of the NBA Finals and the Oklahoma City Thunder are in there. They have two players named Jalen Williams, both spelled the same way.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think one goes by J-Dub, and I think the other goes by J-Will at that point.
I want to know what year all of these Jalen basketball players were born because there are so many Jalens.
This is actually a really interesting bit of culture because Jalen Rose, an NBA player who's now a commentator, I think he played in the 90s and then into the early 2000s, he credits himself as the self-proclaimed first Jalen. And now this is sort of trickled down from Jalen Rose. It's really interesting. I kind of want someone to actually report out the name Jalen and what the etymology of it is. And if Jalen Rose actually is the first Jalen. I doubt he is, but maybe making his name popular is his thing. Anyways, we're not talking about basketball. We're not talking about names. We're talking about American.
I wouldn't have anything to say about that. Anyway, go on.
We're talking about American manufacturing. So before we sort of get into Walmart and American Giant, which are the two main companies you focused on for this piece, let's start with how we got here. So what factors contributed to the offshoring of American apparel manufacturing?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. And I think a lot of us have lost touch with this history because we now live in a world where there's so many clothes that we have access to. They're all so cheap and they're all coming in from Asia. But really, in the 60s, 95% of all clothes that Americans wore were made domestically. America was actually a huge manufacturing hub for the whole world. And we had amazing infrastructure and high quality labor was going into creating these garments. And basically what happened was that it all came down to wanting cheaper clothes. That seems pretty obvious. But basically, it was a very coordinated approach with the whole geopolitical system to try and ensure that Americans had access to cheap clothing. So how did this happen? So for one thing, globalization took place and China's economy opened up in 1978. And China wanted to become the factory of the world. And so the Chinese government invested in all of these factories and actually subsidized the manufacturing of clothes. So in the US, the government basically decided to get rid of tariffs. And so, in the 90s, it signed NAFTA, which basically eliminated tariffs against Mexico to make it easier to import clothing from Mexico. So basically, the US government was part of this process. They wanted Americans to have access to these cheaper clothes. And so then by the time you get into the 90s and 2000s, it is so cheap to manufacture clothes overseas and just import them that none of the US factories can compete anymore. And so by the time you get from 1990 to today, the number of Americans working in clothing manufacturing goes from 900,000, so nearly 1 million Americans were working in this industry in 1990. And now it's 84,000. So basically, over the course of those 3.5 decades, the American clothing manufacturing industry was decimated because we all wanted cheap clothes.
I just want to underscore those figures because that's really striking to me.
Yeah.
900,000 to 84,000. 95% of clothes were made in America in 1960, down to 3%. I mean, that's just total annihilation of an entire industry. And I want to pause for a second because this story is about how Walmart is bringing this back. But curious to know, Liz Segran, what role did Walmart play in the decimation of the apparel manufacturing in the United States happen in the first place?
That's a really good question. And actually, Walmart is a really interesting company. So, it was founded in 1962. And at that time, when most clothes were made in America, Walmart was actually a major buyer of all of these clothes that were made in America. It was actually supporting the US apparel manufacturing industry. But basically, in the 80s, Walmart began to embark on this quest to dominate the world of retail. And the way that it decided to do this was by offering the very cheapest prices on the market. And it believed that this was going to be the way that it would become the dominant retail player in America. Its hypothesis was correct. But the only way for it to accomplish this was for it to really, really push its suppliers to lower their prices. So it first did this with these American companies that were manufacturing here, and it was just asking for lower and lower and lower prices. And at some point, these companies realized that the only way for them to meet Walmart's demands was to start manufacturing these products overseas because they didn't want to lose their biggest buyer. And so Walmart was incredibly integral. Like it was a key player in this offshoring. So if you think about it, the government was on board with offshoring. Walmart was helping to drive this shift. It was a very coordinated approach. And we're seeing the results today. There's basically no American apparel manufacturing left. And it's a very sad situation for American apparel manufacturing in the US now.
What little supply chain do we have left in textiles and apparel manufacturing? And how do we protect that?
Here's where a brand like American Giant enters the scene. So American Giant was founded 12 years ago at the height of the direct-to-consumer movement. But unlike many other direct-to-consumer brands at the time, American Giant's real focus was on trying to make really high-quality clothes in America. And that's just because its founder, Bayard Winthrop, was just kind of obsessed with this idea of making clothes in America again. So what he did was he basically went all over the country to find what remained of this supply chain. And what that really meant was, there might be a factory in North Carolina that was still making a very small quantity of clothes because there are some reasons to make clothes in America still. A lot of uniforms that are made for the US government need to be made domestically.
Right.
So there's this very skeletal remain of factories that are still making here, but 3%, right, of all clothes that Americans buy are made here. So this is very, very small. And so he just went all over the country and he settled on North Carolina, where we see the entire supply chain that still exists at work here. So there are cotton farms there. There are factories that make yarn. There are factories that turn those yarns into fabric, and then there are cut and sew facilities. And so he basically started making a very small quantity of clothes. So we're talking at the beginning, just a few thousand garments. And these clothes were really, really high quality. And a lot of people were really excited about this idea of buying American-made clothes that were so high quality that the company has thrived. So over the last 12 years, it has grown. But the problem is that it's making clothes that are quite pricey. In order to make clothes of this quality in such small quantities in America, his T-shirts are like $50. His hoodies are over $100. That's a premium product. But to answer your question, somebody like him has found what remains of this infrastructure and invested a little bit of money into it.
I would love for you to share with people the reporting process here. Tell everybody what you saw when you went to North Carolina.
It was really interesting. It was not what I expected. So I have been obsessed with this concept for a long time, and I really wanted to go and see what these factories look like. And I wanted to go back all the way to the very beginning of the supply chain where the cotton is farmed. And so I went out there. Bayard was with me. We went and looked at all of these different aspects of the supply chain. And to me, the most interesting thing is how high-tech and automated it is. I think a lot of us think about apparel manufacturing and we think back to the 1960s and 70s when, we remember images and photographs of factories here. But that's not what it's like. I went to this cotton farm, and there are these two brothers who have a little cotton farm, and they basically are able to harvest all of this cotton with just 4 people, because you can now buy these really incredible John Deere machines that are able to plant and harvest enormous quantities of cotton with just 1 or 2 farmers, right? So these machines are able to do the job that 100 people used to be able to do. And then you go through the supply chain. There was this amazing factory called Parkdale Mills, which turns raw cotton into yarn, into threads, basically. And This was a factory that was churning out millions and millions of tons of yarn a week with 23 people. So if you think about this, this factory was so high tech, a lot of the lights weren't even on in most of the factory because there are no humans working in them. They don't even need to use electricity, right? Because there are robots that are doing all of this work. And so the process is now incredibly high tech and automated, and it's not at all what I had in mind. The only part of the supply chain right now that still requires a lot of labor is the very last part of the process. It's called the cut and sew process. And it's literally the part where you get the bolts of fabric, you cut them into the shapes that you need for the garments, and then you sew that. That is the one part of the supply chain that has not yet been automated, but I think it will be soon. And so, to me, I think the important thing to remember here is that this is actually now quite a high-tech, sophisticated industry.
The part of your story that sort of bummed me out in a little bit of a way is that it's sort of like a catch-22 with all of these things. There's so many jobs that were done in the United States that are now gone away. And we look at someone like Bayard Winthrop, an American Giant, who wants to bring back this manufacturing. But really the way that you do that is to not have as many jobs making these garments across. And then you think, well, we want more jobs for people. So maybe it is a good thing that there are jobs for people overseas to do that. But then you have the human rights capacity of it. And then not to mention all of the sustainability aspects and the carbon emissions. I don't know. This bums me out every time we talk about fashion with you, Liz, because it always comes back to destroying the planet.
It's very, very complicated, but I have a kind of a different perspective here. I don't actually think there are that many Americans who are unemployed, right? Like we don't actually have a very high unemployment rate at this point, right? And so I don't think that if we brought back the kind of labor-intensive manufacturing of the past, that we would even have the workers to fill those jobs. Today, there are actually 500,000 open manufacturing jobs today in the US. We just don't have enough people to work in this industry. And so that's one part of the story. But to me, the reason to bring manufacturing back to the United States is not really because we want to bring back American jobs. I know that that's what Donald Trump is saying, but that I don't think is the primary reason for us to do this. I think the more important reason to do this is exactly what you were saying, that the fashion industry is one of the most polluting industries in the world. It produces up to 8% of all climate impact, right? So basically it's accelerating climate change. It is polluting the waters. It's also a huge human rights catastrophe, right? Because we want our clothes to be made so cheaply. They're made in these countries that don't have strong records of protecting workers' rights. And so to me, when people ask me, what do we do to solve this problem? One solution, I think, is to bring manufacturing back to the United States. Why? I think it's because the United States has far stronger environmental regulations than overseas. We have a better track record of protecting workers, although we are by no means perfect. But if you compare this to what's happening in China or Bangladesh, we have stronger minimum wage laws, worker protections. And I think maybe the most important thing is that we cannot manufacture clothes as cheaply here as you can in China and in other places. We can maybe bring prices to the point that the average person can still afford them, but we will never get to fast fashion prices. And I think that that's actually a wonderful thing, because the reason that the fast fashion industry is so polluting is because we're just over consuming. So if we can encourage Americans to value clothes because of their durability, because they are made here in the United States and are willing to pay a little bit more for them, the end result will be that we will buy fewer clothes and we will manufacture fewer clothes. And that will overall help us to eliminate some of these environmental issues that have plagued us with the fast fashion industry. So to me, this is not really about creating jobs in the United States. This is about all of the other things that come along with manufacturing domestically.
Okay, so Liz, that's a perfect segue back to American Giant and Walmart. And I want to understand, how did these two companies create a partnership to begin with?
Yeah, it's a really good question because they're such strange bedfellows, right? They're such different companies. But basically, Bayard Winthrop he's a very interesting person. He's very charming, very passionate about American manufacturing. And he has this vision for bringing American manufacturing back, but he realizes that there is no way that massive change in the global supply chain is going to happen with small startups like his own company. And there are other small, brands that make in America, brands that you might know, like Imogene and Willie, Buck Mason. There are these small companies that are making products here. But to create the kind of change we're talking about, we need to be producing at scale. And when you want to think about companies that are producing at scale, Walmart is the most obvious company that comes to mind. On top of that, Walmart has also declared a huge investment in American manufacturing. It is pouring $350 billion into manufacturing domestically across all kinds of different categories of products, including, fruit and vegetables, including electronics, but also clothing. And so Bayard Winthrop got on a podcast a year ago, and he said, you know what? I really applaud Walmart for this effort to try and make products domestically. And Walmart got wind of this, and within a few weeks, they had invited Bayard to their headquarters. And a few weeks after that, they announced this partnership, and they began working together.
The power of a podcast.
Totally. Right, Josh?
Yeah, thanks. Subscribe, rate, and review.
Totally. But yeah, so they worked together. They produced this $13 t-shirt that came out on the 4th of July last year. 6 months later, they produced a hoodie that was $40. And the partnership has been so successful that they're continuing to make products together. But more importantly, other retailers have gotten wind of what's going on, and they're coming to Bayard to collaborate or just to ask for advice about how they can also make products in America.
How did they get down to $12 and $40 from $50 and $140 for a sweatshirt? That's a huge price decrease from their normal product.
This was one of the most interesting parts of the whole story to me. And Liz and I spent a lot of time talking about this. I mean, it's really fascinating. I think the first thing that I learned is that the first 1,000 to 5,000 products are the most expensive to make in the supply chain.
Right.
And that's because you have to hire people to make these products, and then you have to teach them how to make a particular t-shirt, right, or a particular hoodie. And that is actually a very time-consuming process, and it's a very expensive process because there's a lot of trial and error. You think about how many t-shirts are being made among the first 1,000 that have to be thrown out, and how much time it takes to teach somebody how to make that and then to tweak it a little bit. It takes a lot of time, and time is money in this process. But when you're going from 1,000 of a shirt, which is the kind of scale that a startup is making a product at, to the kinds of volume that Walmart is asking for. So we're talking about 100,000 t-shirts all at once to maybe 1 million t-shirts. Then suddenly the price per unit goes down by a lot. So first of all, it's just kind of the process of figuring out how to manufacture it takes a long time, and that's very expensive. But then when you're making things at larger scale, you have other economies of scale. So you can buy fabric in much larger quantities, which brings down the price. Then you can also start investing in equipment that is more efficient. So when I was in a cut and sew facility, I saw these amazing machines that allow you to cut garments. But the factory that I was at does not make at huge volume. So they could cut through, maybe 20 t-shirts at once or 50 t-shirts at once, right? But there are machines that can cut through 1,000 t-shirts at once. They're just more expensive. But if Walmart puts in an order for 100,000 t-shirts, then that company suddenly has this windfall of cash, which they can go towards buying that new cutting equipment. Or there are all kinds of different types of equipment that can make the process a lot more efficient. And so you can start investing in that kind of equipment. So suddenly, a t-shirt that is $50 can go down to $13. I think another factor here, though, is that American Giant t-shirts are premium t-shirts. So they're using Supima cotton, which is like the highest quality of cotton. You can get very good, high quality cotton that is not as expensive as Supima. And so they were also using sort of more commonly available materials for the t-shirts. But a $13 t-shirt is a t-shirt that almost anybody can afford. You know, you can come from a working class family and buy a couple of those t-shirts and it's not going to break the bank, right? And so this just changes the calculation. You're not thinking about making and manufacturing a luxury product anymore. You're making a product that a lot of people can afford.
When I look at this product, obviously it's a better quality product. We can make the argument that it's better for people to invest in maybe slightly higher priced clothes that'll last longer. But I went on Walmart.com this morning and looked up their t-shirts, and you can get a t-shirt for $5, a 5-pack of t-shirts for $22. I just wonder at some point if the price point doesn't match how long one consumer buying habits will sustain that, and then Walmart, who we've seen this story before, when it was cheaper and people were buying still the stuff that was manufactured overseas, that's the direction that they went. So maybe I'm just more cynical on the long-term output of this, led by Walmart.
You're absolutely right. And I think for this plan to work, we have to be valuing more than the price. And I think in order to do that, you have to cultivate a market. And I think American Giant was really, really good at this because its branding was phenomenal. You know, it has invested a lot of money in taking beautiful photographs of cotton farms and factories and really telling the story of how these products are made so that you value them for the craftsmanship and the quality. So I think that if you're competing just on price, this is going to fail. And so what Walmart needs to do, and I think it's beginning to do this, is to tell a similar story so that people realize what it is that they're getting for the higher price.
What I thought was really interesting in your reporting, and this was a quote from someone at Walmart, is, we're trying to figure out how we can make this a priority because we know this is what our customers want. And to me, that's really fascinating that Walmart, who it is clearly a data-driven retailer, has identified this, albeit on a very small scale, as something that they are investing in, right? So I think you're right, Liz. It's a matter of swaying people from a storytelling perspective and making them understand that there's more to their clothing than just the price.
And I think one other really interesting thing about Walmart is that it really targets this working class customer, especially in rural parts of the country. And by investing in these garments that are made in American factories, it is also investing in its customer, right? I think that's a really interesting part of the story. There's a video that Walmart has on its website about an American factory that makes clothing. And one of the workers there said, what's really great about this is I have this job now. I have more money to spend at Walmart. So I think, it's a really interesting play for them because they're supporting industries, but they're also putting money in the pockets that will go back into Walmart, right?
Let's talk about tariffs. We can make this quick overall. I think I know where the answer is, but obviously it's been the story of the Trump administration so far, this on again, off again tariff push. And you mentioned it a little earlier. The stated reason for a lot of these tariffs is to reshore, bring jobs back to the United States and manufacturing. Is that remotely the effect of these tariffs?
No.
Yeah, right, next question. Well, I guess the add-on to this is what actually would a full court press on bringing American manufacturing back look like?
So the reason that it's so laughable, all of these statements that the Trump administration is making about how these tariffs are going to bring jobs back, is that it is really expensive to build the infrastructure to make clothes in America. This is going to be millions and billions of dollars to set up these high-tech factories that are at work in China and in other countries around the world. And the Trump administration has not spent a cent on investing in American manufacturing. So the tariffs are not going to make this possible. That said, because Trump was throwing these tariffs all over the place, a lot of American brands, for the first time in a long time, began considering what it would look like to make products in America. They began to think, okay, what is still being made here? And I think that is a moment when a lot of brands started going to Bayard and saying, actually, what has this been like? They looked at this collaboration with Walmart and they said, hey, if Walmart is able to produce in these large quantities and at prices that are not luxury prices, maybe we can do the same. So I think the one benefit of the tariffs is that it gave companies a moment to pause and think about what this would look like and maybe begin plotting out how they can maybe start manufacturing a small quantity of their clothes here. So I think that was the only benefit there. But I think longer term, if we really want manufacturing to come back here, we're going to have to invest in factories and infrastructure. And the government is going to have to be part of that. But companies with the scale of Walmart and Target and all of these other, companies that are selling us these clothes, they need to be part of this. And I do think it's possible. I do think that, it didn't take us that long to offshore. It's just been a couple of decades. And I think that if we really wanted to, it would be possible to begin the process of reshoring clothing.
So much more to dive into here, but unfortunately we don't have the time to, which means you should go subscribe to Fast Company Premium, read Liz's piece, and read all the other great journalism that we have there. So we're going to leave it here. We will be back with Liz and Liz for Keeping Tabs later, but first we're going to take a quick break, followed by Yaz's interview with Evan Osnos.
As affordable, reliable energy demand increases at historic rates, one company is uniquely positioned to accelerate America forward: Williams. We have 117 years of know-how in powering progress, and we're ready to power the next 100 years of innovation. Learn how our natural gas infrastructure is critical to the future of AI at williams.com.
In his book, The Haves and Have-Yachts, New Yorker writer Evan Osnos journeys into the world of the super rich, where Flo Rida performs at kids' bar mitzvahs. Yachts get more and more outrageous features like pop-up disappearing restaurants and just a bunch of other rich people shit. His collection of essays takes a look at the new Gilded Age we're in and what that means for American society. Evan sat down with Yaz last week to talk all about his new book. And as a reminder, if you want more from this interview, you can go to Fast Company's YouTube channel to see an exclusive extended cut. All right, here's Yaz's interview with Evan Osnos.
So I read these articles in The New Yorker as they came out. Did you always know they were going to be a collection? Did you decide you were going to start writing a series on the ultra-rich? How did this come about?
Sometimes, as in this case, I started writing a few pieces with an idea in mind that I wanted to understand something. Mm-hmm. And then it became kind of a calling, to use a really overly dramatic description. But I'll be honest, 2016, when Donald Trump was elected president, I realized that the normal tools of political analysis, the way that I usually write about what's happening in the world, were not going to suffice. I couldn't understand how a guy who declared himself the enemy of the elites and voters would subscribe to that idea could somehow inhabit that role while being the billionaire son of a real estate family in New York. And I needed to understand. And the answer to that lay ultimately in trying to understand the mechanics of the big money world. And that was the origins of it.
I'm going to get to that right after this. But how did you persuade your editor to write an article on yachts? You're truly very cushy assignment.
I will say I have not received hardship pay for that one. Try as I might. I had the miraculous good fortune that the editor suggested that piece. I'd been writing some of these pieces in this vein, and he said, "How about yachts?" I said, "Say no more. I'll be back in 6 months. I can be reached at various European addresses." The truth was, it was this sounds ridiculous because I've worked in hard places, but it's kind of a hard story to do because people don't particularly want to talk about it. And that's where the challenge lies.
To go back to the actual point you were making before, you begin the book by talking about how ubiquitous the ultra-wealthy are in the administration. You mentioned that inequality has led to the undoing of many societies. You can go into, now's your history time. Do you think America is there? Like, how do you think about that?
I think we are at a very tenuous moment, and I don't think I'm unique in that impression. I think all of us, no matter where we sit on the political spectrum, and that's a telling fact, that we all look at it and say, this feels really fragile and it feels volatile. And the question, of course, is why? And many people will have multiple explanations. But from my perspective, you can't understand this period in any sensible way without recognizing that we're living at a time of really historic, arguably unprecedented inequality in this country. That's not an abstraction. I mean, we are right now, the richest people in America have a larger share of the nation's wealth than their predecessors did in the Gilded Age, the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers. And if you want to really have an honest conversation about what will it take to hold this country together, and let's remind ourselves, we've been through these moments before and we've found our way back to a more stable, productive, democratic future, then we have to be honest about the facts.
Now, the back third of the book maybe is dedicated to grifters, essentially, which are
alleged in some cases.
Alleged grifters. Tell me about why they fascinated you and also what they say about the kind of second Gilded Age we're living in.
I got fascinated by grifters. I mean, we are, I think, as a country, historically have been. I mean, going all the way back to Ben Franklin was in his own way. I mean, as such a fantastic demonstration of self-actualization, and he created the whole genre of self-help, really, and was a model for so much of what we admire. And he was also the first guy who practiced a little bit of fake it till you make it. And he crystallized this very American idea of we are a nation of people on the move, both physically, geographically, because we're a nation of immigrants, and we are also a country in which people can get up on one coast, move themselves to the other coast, and start all over again. So we have baked into us like the potential for fantastic grift. And I gravitated to a couple of cases, one in particular of a guy who had kind of slipped beneath the radar at the time. He's gotten some more attention, but it's a pretty amazing case of a guy who named Zach Horowitz, who decided he wanted to be an actor and wanted to be a filmmaker.
It is funny how throughout the piece you have people saying he was a terrible actor. You know, like
it was a very persistent theme in the reporting. People kept saying they felt compelled to add, they're like, he really is just perhaps the worst actor I've ever worked with. And I thought that was so interesting because it didn't impede his career. I mean, it kept going. And the reason, and I won't give it all away because it's kind of a fun story, but he found this unholy union between film financing and getting on screen. But as a result, by raising these vast sums of money, he was tapping into something really powerful, which is that there are people around the country who, for whatever reason, say, you know, it might be fun to finance a movie and, you know, maybe someday I'll end up clinking glasses with Tom Hanks or whoever it is. And I always I think of him in my mind in this analogy just because I'm like, if I was a dentist in Omaha, who would I want to clink glasses with? It's probably Tom Hanks. And Zach Horowitz, who really, one director who worked with him, described the experience as like trying to elicit a performance from a cardboard box. Yet he managed to get on screen with like Olivia Munn and Ralph Fiennes and Brian Cox from Succession. And that, for me, is about a story of how does Fake It Till You Make It become like an anthem in this country? And why does it seem to permeate so much of what we see and do?
And it's also funny because he was a bad actor, but all of his investors claim he was remarkably convincing, you know, walking them through fake documents, right?
Completely right. I mean, you nailed it. That's the most interesting thing was that he was a struggling performer on screen, but was an absolutely Academy Award-winning grifter in his personal finances with others.
And, you know, speaking of grift, I go back to the yacht essay, which is probably my favorite in the book because it's a world that I really knew nothing about. And you talk about all the weird loopholes people have, you know, the fact that if you get sued in a country where your yacht is parked, I suppose the country has to like maintain it at a cost of thousands of dollars a day. But you also mentioned, for instance, a lot of crypto billionaires are buying yachts. How do you see yachts as part of like a grift or as part of like a way to hide money or transfer it?
The yachts are a symbol of a world in which capital is more mobile and more fluid and in which borders are kind of liquefied. I mean, and I had this really interesting interview with a guy who has been in this world, in the yachting world, for decades. And he started off when he was like a sailing instructor in this little village in Monaco and kind of watched it turn into this ginormous industry with huge amounts of money on the line. And he said every decade or two, there was like a new industry. First, it was the Greek shipping fortunes. And so you saw Aristotle Onassis.
I still think about your description of having a pool with mosaic tiles on the bottom that rises up to become a dance floor.
If you're looking
very
at
cool.
Something to do at home, it's an option. And you know, one of the things that's so fascinating is like there's always rivalries and status anxieties.
Yeah.
And he was like competing against another shipping magnate who had a slightly larger yacht. And that guy one-upped the rising dance floor by coming up with a gyroscope that would keep his yacht from getting too rocky on the high seas. So it was kind of like, shall we say, a little bit of comparison between the two. They were constantly competing.
Well, you know, I thought about it also because it was Stavros Niarchos, right?
Yes, exactly.
And his son or grandson is now married to, I'm going to get this wrong, Roman Abramovich's ex-wife, I believe.
If
it's
so,
like,
and
it's like such a...
that is the
like,
whole yachting
yeah,
world, by the
yeah.
way. And this is another reason of why I chose these symbols to write about. And let's be honest, the reason I'm writing about yachts is not because I have particularly deep fascination with tying knots. It's because I actually am trying to depict and understand the symbolism of money in our time. And these have become, I think the super yacht is like the super symbol of our era. And that's not an abstraction. That's a literal fact. I mean, there used to be 10 of the largest yachts about a generation ago, and now there are 170. And they occupy this kind of strange place in our culture. They're both visible and invisible. I mean, you see them in the New York Post or in the Daily Mail, but they're designed partly to stay out of reach. But they are the most conspicuous machines that anybody could possibly own.
And they're so funny because they depreciate in value immediately. You know what I mean? It's like such a money pit.
Yeah, the FT, I remember the Financial Times wrote a great piece that described them as about as financially prudent as buying 10 Van Goghs and then holding them above your head while you're treading water. And it is true. I mean, you know, some of the yacht brokers who I talked to and the, you know, manufacturers who I reported on, they would say to me, look, this is not a particularly prudent investment. This is essentially something for people who have limitless resources.
Yeah. But I apologize, I interrupted. You were talking about the sort of history of yacht.
Oh, I was. Yeah, that's right. Well, there was a transition from the shipping generation. Then it was the oil money. And so all of a sudden it was people from Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And they had different needs. You know, they were sailing their yachts around the Arabian Peninsula, and so they were inside all the time. They needed good air conditioning. But what's really interesting about it is it really tells you something about the global economy. Where is the center of gravity at any moment in our time? And after, of course, the first generation of oil money, that's when you started to get the IT fortunes. And then ultimately, the new generation are the crypto yachts. And so you could chart in its own way the history of American economics over the last 60 years by looking at the high seas.
You also talk a little bit about how it's almost, this is not the right way to put it, but easier for a billionaire to live on a luxurious yacht versus living on land, in the sense that it's kind of uncouth to show how rich you are on land in a sense. Like, tell me more about that.
Yeah, it was a Silicon Valley CEO said to me, look, the honest fact is that you can't live in a $500 million house because the optics are weird. Your employees will be enraged at you. He said, but the truth is a $500 million boat's pretty nice.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a strange fact, but it is a fact. This same CEO said to me, the yacht is the best place to, as he put it, absorb excess capital. So it is also a little economic story here about a time in which a certain number of platforms, a certain number of businesses have generated so much because of the ownership structure for their founders and for key investors that they are quite literally encountering this problem of having excess capital and having to figure out ways that you can park it in places that won't cause you blowback socially and culturally and ultimately in business terms. And I think that's one of the themes that I noticed across this world. In a way, this is the natural result of an unthinking cult of scale. And I think that's important. It's slightly heretical to talk about. Of course, it's not that long ago that we were thinking, scale is an unambiguous good. But one of the experiences I had in reporting this book was when I wrote a profile of Mark Zuckerberg a few years ago, was sort of talking to him and to his employees about this period when essentially connecting people, growing, that was a euphemism for growing, was a self-justifying, self-fulfilling idea. It was an end in itself. And the yachts are kind of the symbolic representation of that concept.
I want to talk a little bit about your essay on Greenwich, Connecticut, which you grew up in.
Yeah, that's where I grew up.
When did you decide to write it? Why did you decide to write it?
I grew up in this town right outside New York City. It's always been a prosperous place. It was kind of an amazing place to grow up as a kid. It's the only public high school that I know of that has an electron microscope.
Yeah, that was wild.
Yeah. And there was also a point at which I became aware of the fact that Greenwich told us something really important about something that was happening in Republican politics. Greenwich had been traditionally like the birthplace of the country club Republican.
Yeah, you mentioned the Bushes.
The Bush family was from there. Prescott Bush, who was the father of George H.W. Bush. I mean, he was quite literally the country club golf champion in town. And he was the senator from Connecticut. And he was an old school moderate Republican, what they used to call a Rockefeller Republican. He was actually Ike's golf partner in Washington. But in 2016, the Republican town committee in Greenwich was led by somebody who came out and said, I'm not going to vote for Jeb Bush. I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. And that became kind of a revealing indicator, because in communities and in Republican strongholds that we might have thought of being more inclined towards a John Kasich or a sort of moderate Republicanism, they were lining up with Trump. And that, for me, meant, okay, there's something really important to understand here. And part of the explanation, and this sort of gets to throughout the book, is that there had been a decision along the way, or almost a non-decision, to say we can no longer afford to do the kind of moderate Republican thing that maybe gives a little here and takes a little here, but ultimately believes in working with Democrats. And look, there's an argument to be made that there was a similar thing going on the Democratic side in terms of getting more and more extreme. But when you had the birthplace of country club Republicanism begin to line up with Donald Trump, I said, I got to understand how that happened. And this essay tells that story.
How do you think, as you were reporting, what did you learn about the way American elites paved the way for Trump's election?
I thought a lot about this. I mean, the idea of people in the 1980s and 90s. Remember, Donald Trump, I grew up around New York City, and he was a kind of permanent piece of the media furniture. He was just, he was in the papers all the time, partly because he was pretending to be his own publicist and planting stories. But, that was just like a part of the landscape. And then to see him become something else in the eyes of Americans more broadly through The Apprentice was like a turning point, where all of a sudden he went from being known as a kind of, people here knew him as a marginal business story. He sometimes succeeded. He had a lot of bankruptcies. But through the power of this invented persona, he became the icon of a big city successful capitalist. And look, I think that there is a lot of blame to go around a lot of places for, in a sense, kind of creating the myth of Donald Trump that continued for so long. Part of the reason why the word elite has become so fraught is that Trump used his own position in communities of power to say to the American public, look, because I am an elite, I can help you pick the lock. I will help you understand why it's corrupt, how it works. And therefore, I, dear voter, will give you a piece of the action. That's been his enduring promise. And I will tell you that after a half a century of him selling the illusion of access to power and fortune. He and his family have actually now realized in 2025 that the thing people will pay most exorbitantly for is access to the highest reaches of the United States government. And his son, Don Jr., has created a club called Executive Branch with an initiation fee of up to $500,000, as you probably heard. You're going to need to start saving now. But it will, if you want, get you quite literally what it sounds like, which is access to the executive.
And it's funny because you also talk about the fact that the people he hired ultimately into his cabinet are elites. I mean, the amount of them who, graduated from Harvard, I think you have as examples.
Yeah, and he named 13 billionaires to the highest ranks of his administration. And I want to say something, which is, look, there is nothing inherently wrong with that. You can imagine a scenario in which you say, look, these are people who have succeeded. They understand the market. They understand economics. What becomes a problem is when the administration is so secluded from the experience of regular life that it has a very hard time expressing and enacting the public will. I mean, it was quite telling when Howard Lutnick, Secretary of Commerce, of course, said that his mother-in-law wouldn't notice if her Social Security check didn't show up. I think there's a lot of Americans that probably would notice if their Social Security check didn't show up. I think this is part of what Elon Musk ran into, is that when he started talking about empathy as a weakness of Western civilization or Social Security as a Ponzi scheme, it was a little bit of a revealing indicator of how much his life had become divorced, really, from the experience of ordinary people.
That makes a lot of sense. You talk a lot, and you sort of touched on this earlier about elites sort of deriding other elites and saying, but I'm different because I understand the common man. Why do you think that is so resonant with voters?
It's a fascinating question. I mean, I've noticed that Americans hate the noun, the elite, but we love the adjective elite. So elite Navy SEALs, yes, please. But the Georgetown elite, no thank you. And part of what's happening there is that as the country has become more clearly divided between people who have access to opportunity and power and privilege and everybody else, and I'm not making an abstract statement, we know that in the data, that the gap is just literally larger, that people inevitably begin to say, well, what do they know? How can I get a piece of that? How do I get behind that velvet rope?
I actually remember we were talking about this. Actually, it was over on the Inc. side, which is, I don't work for Inc., but they were saying, their readers can't get enough of reading about Jeff Bezos because they believe on some level, like, I don't hate him because one day I could be him.
Yeah, that's a hugely important point, yes. I actually think that's like a central nerve in this book, too, is that Americans at their core want to get rich. We always have and we always will. That is baked into the American idea. And what's happening now is that people in larger and larger numbers are beginning to realize that there are these impediments to that process. Donald Trump's appeal, part of the reason why he was able to win again was that he is able to say to people, even in an unspoken way, sometimes it's explicit, but exactly as you described, people say, look, I think he wants me to prosper. He wants me to succeed. And I think part of the process of getting people to understand or getting people to visualize some of the fault lines in our economy that are, in fact, making it harder for people to prosper is about not getting people – the key is not saying to people you should give up on the goal of getting rich. The key is on giving people the information and the tools to understand why they're not.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. This is something I have been thinking about a lot, and I thought about a lot when I read your book, which is when you're talking about elites who have yachts, are they completely divorced from understanding the common person? Do you think they do and they want to kind of take advantage of it? You know what I mean? Like, how big is that gulf?
I think that the experience of entering into that world is actually farther away from regular life than outsiders imagine. I mean, just as a practical fact, actually a yacht owner said to me at one point, look, I think this is the last truly luxurious lifestyle. As he said, this is the last place you can get away with it. And there was another yacht owner who said on a documentary, he said, I think if the public ever knew what it's really like on these yachts, that they'd bring back the guillotine. And it sounds like a joke, except that part of what's happening is that they are aware. And actually, that one of these owners said to me, he's like, if you don't have some guilt about it, then you're not really self-aware. I think that there is this feeling that it is a world of service and luxury that is really so far apart from a world in which, let's be frank, people struggle every day to get healthcare, to get education, to pay their rent. And there is a way in which it becomes harder and harder for a political commons, like a political society, which is, after all, what a country is, to have these two things within the perimeter. And there was a really prophetic comment like a century ago from Louis Brandeis, who went on to join the Supreme Court. And he said, you can either have democracy or you can have money concentrated in the hands of a small number of people, but you can't have both. And I think that was one of the observations that led to the New Deal and to an effort to try to shift the balance from a concentration of resources into the hands of too few into a more equitable distribution, which did lead for decades to what was, ultimately a period of rising standards of living for more people. And that period came to an end in the late 1970s, early 80s. And I think there is a recognition on the part of some in politics that we need to figure out a way to get back to that.
I want to do a speed round here. Favorite essay to write?
It was actually the one about pop stars doing private gigs.
That, you know what? I knew I'd forgotten to ask you about one, and that was it.
Well, I have to say,
Flo Rida comes off very well in that piece.
He really should, and he deserves to.
I
embedded with Flo Rida for a bar mitzvah and some other things. But it was an experience that you do say to yourself as you're doing it, I think I will be able to die happy having done that.
Did you attend a lot of private performances, or did you mostly hear about them?
I can't talk about the reporting, Yaz. This is a privileged fact. No, the fact is I was able to go.
You were on stage with Flo Rida at a child's bar mitzvah.
I wasn't on, well, let's just say I wasn't on stage, but I was able to attend these events in his entourage. And it was like being dropped through a trap door into a world that people hear about. You'll read about, I just saw that Mick Jagger played a birthday party.
When I was a kid, I used to watch My Super Sweet 16, and that was always the biggest element of the that and the car reveal. But
the reason I got interested in that was like, well, what are the economics of that? I mean, what makes a pop star who could be performing in front of 40,000 screaming fans say, actually, I'm going to go to a Sweet 16 in Teaneck.
And it's streaming, right?
Let's be honest, in the end, it's not that complicated what motivates them to go. But the reason why this is an artifact of our time, why it's like a new thing. There was a drummer who I interviewed who does a lot of privates, and he said to me, the simple fact was, until recently, people couldn't afford to have the Foo Fighters in their backyard on a Thursday. And now they can. And so I sometimes feel like I'm like a historian writing in real time about a world that we need to describe while it exists.
My father was a diplomat for a long time and then was a lawyer at Microsoft. And I always think about the fact that I believe they had Sheryl Crow play one year at their big employee gathering. They had Pink. And then when the financial crisis hit, they had a U2 cover band.
That sounds about right.
Which is so funny.
Yeah, that sounds exactly right. I think there are times that you can tell when a company is doing well because they've got these big name acts. But it's also gotten to the point where it's a little bit of smoke and mirrors, that sometimes a company that's really on the ropes will hire a really big name because people will say, well, I mean, I guess.
This is we need to look like we're.
And then the next year, they've got somebody else. That's a bad sign.
You addressed Beyonce performing at that hotel in Dubai in your piece, but I always think about when her and Jay-Z performed at an Uber thing in exchange for stock. It was like one of the most lucrative deals.
I mean, that's called good management. And they're probably doing it themselves, but it is just really good planning. But I think, look, if you step back and you say to yourself, what's fascinating about that is that right there is a transaction between billionaire and billionaire. And it is a reason why the curve, when you get to a certain point, this is probably like the takeaway on the whole book, which is that when you can kind of get on board a certain kind of opportunity and experience, then the curve goes vertical and you get access to all kinds of other things. And that can be both really satisfying for people in that position, it can be quite dangerous for a country because it means that those people are then getting further and further from the experience of everybody else. And frankly, I think it's perilous for those individuals because they run the risk of suddenly encountering a kind of backlash, realizing, oh, they've lost touch with the people they were supposed to be in touch with.
Sort of the ability to be in the room that others can't. I remember interviewing there's a really famous movie director, whose name I can't say, and off the record, he was like, I was like, I don't know, I didn't say this to him, but I was like, your movies have been failures, I've been told. You know, you had a bad period and you're self-financing. And he was like, oh, well, I was part of the friends and family round at Facebook, because he knew someone, right?
Yeah.
And I always think about that as like there's a certain stratum that you get to. It's probably not a correct use of the word. Where
I think it sounds right. And it's exactly right.
Billions beget billions.
That's 100% right. And, interestingly, Warren Buffett is very candid about this. He's, in a lot of ways, I think we could do better as a culture by listening more to Warren Buffett and less to Elon Musk.
And we listen to Warren Buffett a lot, but we just don't act on it.
Well, he is the one who makes the point that at a certain point, the arithmetic momentum of a giant fortune allows it to keep growing unless you really go out of your way to screw it up. And so he's part of the chorus of people who say we need to do a better job of then figuring out how to drive that fortune out into society so that it gets into the hands of people who have more utility for it.
Yeah, get people to pay taxes, which is part of the Getty essay, right?
Exactly. That was a really interesting, kind of an amazing world to dip into in that piece, because one of the essays in this book, as you say, is about, in a sense, the tax secrets that allow a big fortune to go unmolested by estate taxes and other taxes along the way. And I think that part of what Buffett has been saying over the years, which he says repeatedly, is it makes no sense for Warren Buffett, to pay less and my effective tax rate is lower than my secretary's. He says, how does that make sense? And the country has had these moments of listening to him and then forgetting about it and kind of moving on. But he is talking about the heart of the matter. It is very hard historically to find examples of countries that succeed if they get into this dynamic. I mean, not to be gloomy, we'll get into a happier note, but it's worth remembering, and I quoted in the book, that the great scholar of Rome, Ramsay MacMullen, who taught at Yale for a long time, he was once asked if you would summarize the epic history of the fall of Rome as concisely as possible, what would you say? And he said, well, it took 500 years, but it can be distilled into 3 words, which is fewer had more. I think we're wise to heed that lesson sometimes.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, Evan, thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, yes. Thanks for having me.
Okay, we're back, and it's time to wrap up the show with Keeping Tabs. This is where each one of us shares a story, trend, or piece of pop culture we're following right now. So, Segran, I'm actually gonna use the last names. What are you keeping tabs on?
Okay, so I recently did a story about, so it's very different from what we were talking about before. We're talking about Walmart. I'm going to talk about a retailer on the other end of the spectrum. It's Printemps, which is this French department store that just set up shop in New York. And I was in New York over the weekend. I wanted to go check it out. It is basically like they created an art gallery experience where, Manolo Blahnik shoes are like on a pedestal, and it's very beautiful. But I want to talk about their restaurant. So I went to dinner at their restaurant over the weekend, and it is the most interesting concept. So basically, it's a French company. And so the menu I thought would be French, but it's not. It's actually, the chef has put together dishes from all of the French colonies around the world. So every dish.
Fascinating.
Amazing.
Fascinating. Every dish is inspired by a French colony. So there was a chicken dish that was inspired by Moroccan cuisine. There was a fish dish. My favorite dish was the grouper. It was a fish dish that was inspired by Haitian cuisine. And there was like a soup that was inspired by Laos and like Laotian cuisine.
Is it like a fusion where it's like French techniques, but with these sort of cultural ingredients and techniques?
No, I would say that he was just really trying to perfect that local cuisine. And that's really cool. But it was just beautifully served. It was given the haute cuisine, or like very, very elegant plating and things like that. But it was elevating the food cultures of those colonies. It was a brilliant idea. The food was really, really delicious. And so I highly recommend it. It's called Maison Passerelle is the name of the restaurant. And so if you have like a birthday dinner or like a fancy event, that you'd like to do something special for, I really recommend Maison Passerelle.
Josh, it's really close to the office. So
it is?
Just pop on over.
I love that. I've said many times on the show, I love a tasting menu. I love a fine dining experience. It's a big thing. And I've been watching like way too much Top Chef recently. So this is right up my alley.
Yeah, it's like, the chef, is it called Chef's Plate? What was the name of the show? The Chef's Table? Chef's Table, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the beautiful like the slow motion of the plating and the flowers. That's the experience you're going to get at Maison Passerelle.
Gorgeous overhead shot of hands plating food and tweezers.
100%. You're going to be the person who is like taking pictures of your food because it's just so beautiful.
Stinson, what are you keeping tabs on?
Yeah, so mine is a lot nerdier than Segran's. Over the weekend, I went to a show at the Natural History Museum's planetarium.
I love that place.
Yeah, it was amazing. Pedro Pascal, he narrated the show, and it was all about the Milky Way galaxy, and it was really cool. So learned a lot there. But the Milky Way is following the sun as it moves through outer space. So basically, it's just like a giant magnet pulling us through space. But I thought it was really interesting that he was the narrator. Maybe this happens often. I'm sure they always try to get celebs to do these things to pull people in, but it was a big
That's a
drop.
buzzy one, though.
It's a buzzy one. He's everywhere right now. And I have not seen The Materialist, but I definitely want to go. I've heard it's not.
Is it good?
I've heard varying opinions on it, but I love a rom-com, and so I will willingly go.
I saw it over the weekend. It was totally worth it. What I like about it is that it's a play on a rom-com. It's like it's really taking the structure of the rom-com and turning it on its head, and it gives you a lot to think about. But also like Pedro Pascal.
I know.
Down to earth, sexy.
A man of science.
I know.
A man of science. I love Pedro Pascal. I think he's excellent. I'm most excited for the fact that he's been rumored to be a Bond villain in one of the upcoming films, which, listen, a lot of people had feelings about the Broccolis selling or handing over the rights to Amazon. But if they bring Pedro Pascal into the franchise, I'd be all for that. Although he'll probably be a Bond villain, but be like a union organizer, and that's the villain for Amazon.
Yeah, true, fair. That would be cool.
All right, I'll wrap this up with my keeping tabs. I'm keeping tabs on the NYC mayoral primary, which is next week. And I don't want to get into the nitty gritty. So for those who don't know, who aren't in New York City, or it's pretty national at this point, it's basically coming down to a ranked choice voting competition between Andrew Cuomo, disgraced former governor, and Zohran Mamdani, who is a 33-year-old Democratic socialist who's really kind of surged and grown in the polls. It is the election that's launched 1,000 think pieces from reactionary centrists, including one from Annie Lowry this past week, which was sort of weird. But that's not what I care about. What I care about is that Zohran Mamdani used to be a rapper.
Whoa.
That went by the moniker Mr. Cardamom.
Mr. Cardamom.
Mr.
Nice.
Cardamom, yeah.
Amazing.
And he has a song called Nani, which is basically like sort of like a campy trap beat sort of song that's basically a love letter to his grandmother. And it's really good.
Love it.
Get that
It's
man in
so
office.
good. Like, he's actually really quite good and very charming. And there's a music video behind it. So I just want to play out this episode with Nani by Mr. Cardamom and wrap up the show.
He comes from cultural royalty, right? Like his mom made Mississippi Masala. I mean, she's a filmmaker. And plus he also has done a lot of ads in Hindi, which I think is awesome. For New Yorkers who speak other languages. I love it. I mean, I'm excited. But yes, can't wait to hear that song.
It's the Nani anthem, Jimmy of the bantam, weight class, warp ass, and all your ransom. Got a grandson that's handsome and then some, spends his income on dim sum to fill some.
I mean, it's a fascinating set of candidates. I can't wait for the primary to be over, although no matter who wins the primary between the two of them, I think they're both going to end up running in the general anyways, because Cuomo said he's going to run as an independent. Eric Adams is already running as an independent. And the
Family
what's
Party.
the party? Working Families Party. My producer is Sam has just told me that it's the Working Families Party that might nominate and run Zorhan in the general election. Anyway, so we'll do this all again in November, but fascinating election in NYC. And that's a great place to wrap it up. That's it for Most Innovative Companies. Segran, thanks so much for being here. And
Thanks
Stinson,
for having me.
thanks so much for co-hosting with me today.
Anytime.
And you should also know that Liz is co-hosting her own podcast starting next week with Mark Wilson, friend of the show Mark Wilson, called By Design. You can hear that show in this feed on Tuesday. And you can also subscribe to By Design on any of your podcast apps. So go do that, hear more of Liz, hear more of Mark, and it's a great show. We've been recording the first episode as an interview with Michael Beirut. It's awesome, it's excellent, and a bunch of other topics. Our show is produced by Avery Miles and Blake Odom with help from Sam Gabauer and Hawa Atori. Editing by Matt Toder. Mix and sound design by Tad Wadhams and Nicholas Torres. Our executive producer is me, Josh Christensen. Remember again to subscribe, rate, and review, and we will see you next week.